All right, before we talk about what happens at the neuromuscular junction and how we get the signal, the stimulus to contract the muscle, I need to go over a little bit about what is an action potential. All right, so in a cell, we know that a cell is polarized. All cells at rest exhibit the resting membrane potential. And it's about negative 70 millivolts. Okay, so millivolts, and we're going to do this over time here. So this is resting membrane potential. Again, the cell is polarized. Polarized, okay? And it would make sense to look at it as, well, if the resting membrane potential is at negative 70, then in order to do something, we need an action potential, which is a different number than negative 70, because if it's at negative 70, it's at rest, okay? So the action potential is what stimulates the muscle to contract. That's the communication that comes from the nervous system that stimulates the muscle, okay? So in the membrane, the cell membrane, we know that the cell membrane is polarized, and that means the inside of it, of the membrane, is negative 70 millivolts. So the inside is negative and the outside is positive. Okay? So in an action potential, we're going to briefly increase the voltage on that membrane from negative 70 to some positive number and then back down, just briefly. And that's the action potential. Okay? So if this is the neuron or the muscle cell, either one, because they're both going to carry the action potential, but here they are at rest, is in the red. So in an action potential, what makes the cell, what gives it that resting membrane potential, is the movement of sodium and potassium, mainly potassium, because there's tons of open channels for potassium, so it's always diffusing out at a pretty good amount. There's only a few open channels for sodium that are moving back inside the cell. Okay, but that's what gives it that negative 70 millivolts. So in an action potential, gated channels, and they are voltage gated channels, for sodium are opened. So if we have voltage gated channels for sodium, they open. Okay? And if they open, sodium is going to fly into the cell. And when the sodium comes into the cell, it's going to make the inside of that more positive. So it's going to get more positive, and that is called depolarization. So the membrane is polarized, it's at rest, now we're depolarizing it. Okay? But guess what? There are also voltage gated channels for potassium. And when this change in potential occurs, then these open. Potassium leaves the cell, making the cell more negative again. So it repolarizes it. So it repolarizes it down to eventually resting. So resting membrane potential here. Okay, and remember the resting membrane number is maintained by the sodium-potassium pump. So it regulates and becomes -70 utilizing the sodium-potassium pump. So an action potential is the depolarization then repolarization of the membrane. And it's a brief thing. It's part of a second, okay? There's just a brief moment that this occurs. So that is the action potential, and that is the stimulus for making the muscle contract, okay? So let's go back and apply this and look at the neuromuscular junction.